say the only man who Billy the Kid ever truly feared was Dave Rudabaugh, and for good reason. After all, legend has it that it was Rudabaugh who schooled Doc Holliday on how to use a gun. But then again, there's lots of stories about Dave Rudabaugh. Some true and others, well, not so much. Join me today as we attempt to separate fact from fiction. We'll examine Dave's short-lived career as a train robber and find out what caused Wyatt Earp to describe him as the most notorious outlaw in the range country. While we're at it, we'll discuss Rudabaugh's time as a hired gun for the railroad, his association with Billy the Kid, what it was like being arrested by both Pat Garrett and Bat Masterson, his alleged involvement in the shootings of Morgan and Virgil Earp, and a ton more. We got a lot of ground to cover today. Hell, we'll even take a look at his various nicknames. Was it Arkansas Dave or Dirty Dave? Is it true he killed 65 men, not counting Mexicans and Indians? Whose gang was it anyway? And did Dave really lose his head down in old Mexico? You may think you know who Dave Rudabaugh was, but I guarantee you've never heard a story told quite like this. David Rudabaugh was born in Illinois on July 14, 1854. His father, James, served with the Union Army but disappeared shortly after mustering out in 1863, after which the remainder of the family would move to Kansas by way of Iowa. And that's about the extent of our knowledge when it comes to Dave's early life. You'll often read that he got his start as a bandit over in Arkansas, and that he, along with fellow outlaws Mysterious Dave Mather and Milton Yarberry, had to flee the state after killing a rancher. Story goes that Rudabaugh then drifted north to the Black Hills where he began robbing stagecoaches. Or was it Texas? Turns out there's a lot of bad information out there on old Dave Rudabaugh, much of which has been shaped by equally bad biographies and dime novels. And if I'm being perfectly honest, podcasters like myself. Fact is, by 1875, a then 21-year-old Dave was still living with his mama in Greenwood County, Kansas. There is zero historical evidence of him ever so much as setting foot in Arkansas, much less the Black Hills. Now, we will discuss a few more misconceptions here in a bit, including Rudabaugh's various nicknames and whether or not he taught Doc Holliday how to use a gun. But so far as his criminal career is concerned, Dave's first known crime wouldn't occur until January 27, 1878. That's when he and a few of his buddies tried to rob the westbound train at Kinsley, Kansas. And I say tried because they failed miserably. Ended up walking away empty-handed, and then, just a month later, Rudabaugh found himself in the custody of Ford County Sheriff Bat Masterson. In the weeks that followed, Dave's compadres were likewise apprehended. And after a botched jailbreak attempt, they was all sentenced to do hard time at Leavenworth. All of them except for Rudabaugh, that is. Turns out he ended up cutting a deal with the prosecution. Yes, Dave Rudabaugh snitched out his pals, even went so far as testifying against them during the trial. By the way, this type of self-preservation is going to be somewhat of a trend throughout the rest of Dave's life. Pretty much every time he got arrested, he confessed to everything. And more often than not, it did work out in his favor. Now, Dave would lay over in Dodge City for a spell following his release. And it's there where he was quoted by a local paper saying that he was looking for a job and that he intended to earn his living on the square. Now, I love that word intended. And you know what they say about the road to hell being paved with good intentions. Sure enough, just 5 months later, Dave and two of his buddies held up a stagecoach a few miles south of Las Vegas, New Mexico. Now, before we go any further, let's go ahead and address yet another falsehood regarding the life of Dave Rudabaugh. More specifically, his supposed involvement in the Royal Gorge War. Long story short, this so-called war was an armed conflict between railroads fighting over who got to lay the first tracks through Colorado's Royal Gorge. The aforementioned Bat Masterson was involved. He'd even raised a small army of fighting men to aid one of the factions, an army that included the likes of noted gunman Ben Thompson and future Rudabaugh associate J.J. Webb. The same J.J. Webb, by the way, who, as a deputy, helped to arrest Dave back in January of 1878. As for Rudabaugh, though, there's really nothing in the way of evidence showing that he took part in the Royal Gorge War. And while we're on the topic of evidence, there's also no proof that he gave shooting lessons to Doc Holliday. Don't get me wrong, Rudabaugh most definitely knew Doc Holliday, both in Kansas and then later on down in New Mexico. But as far as him educating Doc on how to wield a hand cannon, or even joining Bat Masterson to go fight in the Royal Gorge War, there's just no proof of either of those things ever happening. Stories like these are always fun, but you gotta at least have a semblance of evidence, right? Some type of documentation, or at very least something other than just hearsay. Now, you may be asking yourself, where do all these stories come from if they're not true? Well, most of the tall tales surrounding Rudabaugh seem to have originated with a Catholic priest turned historian named Francis Stanley. His book, Dave Rudabaugh, Border Ruffian, contains quite a few errors. And many of these falsehoods have simply been repeated as gospel, both by other historians. So, yeah, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing outside of the musings of Father Stanley that placed Rudabaugh in the Royal Gorge War. Likewise, when it comes to him giving shooting lessons to Doc Holliday. If you have additional information stating otherwise, with sources, I really can't stress enough about how little we know of Rudabaugh's life. If it wasn't for him rubbing shoulders with much more famous people like Billy the Kid, then there's a good chance none of us would even know his name. And to be completely honest, we really aren't even sure about his name. Dave and his family can only be found on one census, the one from 1875, and the family name on that census is spelled Rodenbaugh, as opposed to Rudabaugh. Then, when Dave confessed to that Kinsley train robbery, he dropped the N and spelled it Rudabaugh. Somewhere along the way, it just sort of morphed into Rudabaugh, and I guess that's the version that stuck. Thankfully, Dave's actions do clear up a mite once he arrived in New Mexico. Las Vegas, New Mexico to be exact. About as wild as the town as you could hope to find back in the 1870s. Hell, according to historian Ralph Emerson Twitchell, quote, "Without exception, there was no town which harbored a more disreputable gang of desperados and outlaws than did Las Vegas." And by the time Dave Rudabaugh arrived, the town was firmly in the grasp of Hoodoo Brown and the Dodge City Gang. The Missouri-born Hoodoo, real name Hyman Neal, was a gambler who had somehow conned his way into not only becoming the mayor of Las Vegas, but also the coroner and the damn justice of the peace. His buddy and former Ford County deputy J.J. Webb was the town marshal, in addition to being a co-owner in Doc Holliday's saloon, and mysterious Dave Mather served as one of Webb's deputies, as did future Billy the Kid pal Tom Pickett. These old boys were crooked as hell, to say the least. So it's really no big surprise that Rudabaugh would soon join the ranks as a Las Vegas constable. Once again, not a lot is known about Rudabaugh's actions there in Vegas as a lawman. But as I alluded to earlier, he and two of his buddies, one of whom was also a fellow deputy, Joe Carson, ended up robbing a stage just outside of town on August 14th, 1879. And although they were arrested, the charges were mysteriously dropped. Imagine that. Matter of fact, 3 other men ended up getting falsely convicted and sentenced to prison. I guess that's how it goes when your boss has the run of the town. Now, Joe Carson, the deputy who helped Rudabaugh during that holdup, he himself would be gunned down just 5 months later. Apparently, Carson had accused some Texas cowboys of stealing a buggy. They didn't much appreciate such accusations and got themselves good and liquored up and located the errant deputy at a Vegas dance hall. Mysterious Dave Mather, who, if you'll recall, was also a deputy, spotted the cowpokes and told him to stand down. Rather than comply, one of them, a guy by the name of Tom Henry, shucked his revolver and shot Carson in the arm. This was followed by Mysterious Dave shooting Henry. Per a news article published a few days later, quote, "Immediately after the firing of the second shot by Dave Mather, the lamps in the dance hall were extinguished by repeated concussions, and then followed a scene that beggars description. At least 30 shots were fired almost simultaneously, the leaden missiles of death flying as thick as hailstones around the crowded room." End quote. By the time the smoke cleared, Deputy Carson lay dead, his body riddled by at least 8 bullets. Tom Henry had taken around to the leg, but was still able to escape with his pard, Jim Dorsey. As for the other 2, they was just shot all to hell. One of them would soon die, and the other was thrown behind bars, despite having taken rounds to both the chest and the lower abdomen. Like I said, Henry and Dorsey escaped, but they were soon caught by our very own Dave Rudabaugh and thrown in the same jail as their wounded partner. And just a couple of nights later, a lynch mob came a-calling. The prisoners were led to the town square, where one of them was hanged from the windmill by his neck till he was dead. The remaining 2 were then forced to stand on said windmill, as, according to a paper out of Santa Fe, they were, quote, "perforated with bullets," end quote. Now, I don't know if this was in order to save money on rope or not, but legend has it that Deputy Carson's widow was the one who pulled the trigger. How accurate that is, I'll leave that up for you to decide. It's also unclear as to whether or not Rudabaugh helped out with these executions. I do think it's likely, considering how close he was to Joe Carson. Now, this lynching occurred on February 8th, 1880. Skip ahead less than a month later, and there would be yet another deadly incident there in Vegas. One that would end up having some pretty serious ramifications for our topic du jour. According to the March 9th, 1880 edition of the Dodge City Globe, quote, "At about 4 a.m., 3 men headed by Michael Kelleher entered the Goodlet and Roberts saloon, all being intoxicated and heavily armed. They soon became very boisterous. Police officer Webb, being present and fearing trouble would arise, ordered them to depart. Kelleher refused, exclaiming, 'I won't be disarmed.' He drew his pistol and was just in the act of leveling the weapon when Webb, taking in the situation at once, as quick as a wink, pulled his pistol and instantly fired a ball into his assailant's breast. Kelleher dropped to his side but still showed fight. The officer fired twice more, balls lodging in the breast and head. Kelleher dropped over on the floor and died without speaking. End quote. And yeah, that's the official story. Turns out things may have been a tad more complicated than just a drunk refusing to hand over his gun. You see, the victim, Mike Kelleher, had just finished driving a load of freight all the way from South Dakota and had over $2,000 on his person, which, adjusted for inflation, is close to $64,000 in today's money. Just so happens that Rudabaugh was also in the saloon when Kelleher was killed, as was the town mayor / coroner, Hoodoo Brown. And surprise, surprise, according to both Dave and Brown, the killing of Kelleher was justifiable. And to be honest, that might just be the case. There are people, even to this day, who think that Webb was justified. Of course, it didn't help matters none when his boss, Mayor Hoodoo, skipped town with all Kelleher's money. Wasn't long before a local judge put two and two together, and J.J. Webb was arrested by the San Miguel County Sheriff and charged with murder. I guess the idea being that Brown had put him up to assassinating Kelleher just to get to the money. Webb was tried, found guilty, and sentenced to hang. And just 3 weeks later, our very own Dave Rudabaugh attempted to bust him out of jail. Once again, maybe. Lots of maybes when it comes to Dave Rudabaugh. Now, by all accounts, Rudabaugh and Webb were pretty tight. Dave would even pay frequent visits to the jail in order to bring Webb tobacco and newspapers. And according to Dave, that's exactly what he was doing on April 2nd, 1880. The only thing is, he wasn't alone. Joining Dave on this jailhouse visit was a very inebriated friend of his by the name of John Allen. And for whatever reason, Allen decided to pull out a six-shooter and gun down the jailer, Antonio Lino Valdez. Allen then strolled over, grabbed the keys off of Valdez's body, and tossed them to Webb, who, to his credit, refused to unlock the cell. Apparently, his lawyers were working on an appeal, so rather than becoming an accessory to murder, Webb just decided to stay put. As for Rudabaugh and Allen, well, they hauled ass out of town as quickly as possible. Dave to Fort Sumner and Allen to an early grave. Per the Las Vegas Optic, quote, Allen met his death a few weeks after the break from Las Vegas. Sick and crippled with rheumatism, life became a burden to him, especially as he could get no medical attention. He frequently besought Rudabaugh to kill him, and the latter, as they were riding along one day, put his pistol to Allen's head, blew his brains out, and buried him by the roadside in the sand near Alkali Wells. End quote. And like I said a minute ago, this is followed by Dave making his way to Fort Sumner and joining up with the infamous Billy the Kid. Now, just to put things into perspective, this was well after the Lincoln County War. Doc Scurlock had already retired to Texas, Frank and George Coe were up in Colorado, and Jose Chavez was busy doing his own thing down in Lincoln. Charlie Baldry was still hanging around, but he too had grown weary of being on the run and was tempted to distance himself. That being the case, by the time Rudabaugh came along, the Kids' core group seems to have consisted of relative newcomers like Billy Wilson, Tom Folliard, and Tom Pickett. And yes, that is the same Tom Pickett that served along Rudabaugh as the Las Vegas constable. And really, this was about the worst possible time for Rudabaugh and Pickett to have linked up with the Kid. By late 1880, Billy was not only being hunted by the Secret Service and a posse of gunmen out of Texas, but also his old friend, the newly elected Lincoln County Sheriff, Pat Garrett. If you'd like to learn all the gritty details, I do have a series on both Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett. Links down below to both of them in this episode's description. Now, you'd think with all this extra heat, Billy and the gang would want to lay low, but I reckon that weren't their style. Hell, in October of 1880, they would rob a mail coach just a few miles north of Fort Sumner, a crime that Rudabaugh committed in his underwear. According to an eyewitness, quote, only one man approached the buckboard. He was on horseback, and the other two men who remained a little off the road were backing him. All three men were masked, and the two who stayed back wore only their underclothes. End quote. Now, I really haven't got a clue as to why they were in their skivvies, but I assume it was so their clothes wouldn't give them away. And contrary to popular belief, Billy the Kid was not involved in this particular robbery. The other two men helping Dave were Pickett and Billy Wilson, with Wilson being the one that remained dressed. That said, the Kid would be present just a month later when Rudabaugh and the others made off with a small herd of horses belonging to Alexander Grezelkowski, a.k.a. Padre Polaco. The stolen steeds were taken to the Great House Ranch just outside of White Oaks, followed by the bandits heading into town stocking up on provisions. Provisions that they allegedly declined to pay for. That being the case, a posse caught up with them just a few days later at a place known as Coyote Springs. Although a brief firefight did ensue, the only casualties were horses, and Billy and Rudabaugh were able to escape and make their way on foot back to the Great House Ranch. And if you've ever seen the movie Young Guns 2, you kind of sort of have a pretty good idea of what happens next. The posse found him yet again, and a deputy sent a note inside telling the outlaws that they were surrounded and to come out with their hands up. According to the messenger, quote, I took the note in and delivered it to the one I knew to be Billy the Kid. He read the paper to his compadres, who all laughed at the idea of surrender. They told me to rest easy and not be alarmed, as no harm would come to me from them. They sent me out with a note demanding to know who the leader of the party was and invited him into the house to talk the matter over. End quote. Now, the leader in question was Lincoln County Sheriff's Deputy / saloon owner William Hudgens. And rather than accept the kid's invitation, he sent another member of the posse in his stead, a guy by the name of James Carlisle. Once again, for all you fans of Young Guns, this is sounding very familiar, right? In the movie, this little standoff took place in a whorehouse owned by the sultry and seductive Jane Greathouse. And as much as I love Jane's appearance, especially the part where she rode away in her birthday suit, the fact remains that she never truly existed. In real life, the boys were at a house owned by James Greathouse. Not Jane, James. Although I wasn't able to determine when or where James was born, he earned himself the nickname Whiskey Jim on account of selling illegal booze to the Native Americans. He got ran out of Texas by Colonel Ronald McKenzie, spent a brief period as a buffalo hunter, and eventually opened up this little joint outside of White Oaks, the same place where Billy and Rudabaugh found themselves facing off with that posse. And when Jimmy Carlisle agreed to come inside and negotiate with the outlaws, it was Greathouse who took his place with the lawmen. It was understood that if anything happened to Carlisle, then Whiskey Jim would be the first to pay the piper. As I'm sure you can imagine, tensions were running a bit high. As soon as Carlisle stepped inside, he was effectively just taken hostage. Not only that, but Billy Bonney forced so much whiskey down the man's throat that he was a stumbling drunk in no time flat. A very nervous, probably scared out of his mind, stumbling drunk. Finally, Deputy Hudgens called out an ultimatum. Come out now with your hands up, or we will kill Jim Greathouse. As the minutes began ticking by, one of the law dogs got nervous and accidentally discharged his firearm. And just as soon as the gun went off, here comes Carlisle diving headfirst through the front window, getting himself shot all to hell in the process. Now, to this day, nobody can say for sure who exactly killed Carlisle. According to Billy the Kid, it was the posse. And according to the posse, it was Billy the Kid. One of the deputies who was there, James Bell, would later claim that he heard Rudabaugh admit that it was him, Billy the Kid, and Billy Wilson who gunned down Carlisle. But according to Rudabaugh biographer David G. Thomas, there's no evidence backing that up other than the word of Deputy Bell. Either way, the posse soon disappeared, and the kidding gang were able to get while the getting was still good. Now, as all this was happening, Pat Garrett was making a few inroads of his own. He had recently led a posse in a sweep from Roswell all the way to Fort Sumner. And while they were unable to catch Rudabaugh or the Kid, they did apprehend J.J. Webb. Remember him? But Josh, I thought you said that Webb refused to escape. Yeah, when Rudabaugh and Allen killed that guard, Webb did initially decline. But I guess he got to thinking about how that noose would feel around his neck and soon had a change of heart, escaping with 5 other prisoners on November 10th, 1880. Interestingly enough, Webb would later tell an unidentified source, quote, Hoodoo told me to shoot Kelleher if he made any bad break, as Kelleher was going to kill the first officer he saw. Hoodoo lied to me, got me in trouble, and deserted me, and now I propose to hunt him up and kill him. Of course, Sheriff Garrett got to him before he had a chance to square things up with Brown. Luckily for Webb, his appeal was upheld, and Governor Lew Wallace commuted his death sentence to just life in prison. He would escape yet again about a year later, but you're going to have to wait a few minutes to hear how that goes. Spoiler alert. Our very own Dave Rudabaugh was involved. Okay, so it was on November 25th when Garrett arrested Webb. And less than a month later, he headed right back up there to Fort Sumner with yet another posse. Billy and his pals were alerted to their presence, though, and lit out for the safety of the Wilcox Ranch. Or I guess I should say the perceived safety. You see, Pat Garrett was getting crafty and knew that at least a few of the locals were getting about fed up with the Kid. That being the case, he was able to turn a few of Billy's pards and have them pass on the word that he, Sheriff Garrett, had already left Fort Sumner and returned home. The hope was that Billy would pop his head up just as soon as he thought the coast was clear. And believe it or not, the ruse did work. Late on the evening of December 19th, Garrett and the posse heard horses approaching. Just so happened that the 2 Toms, Folliard and Pickett, were riding up front. As soon as they got within distance, Pat yelled out for him to halt, and Folliard instinctively went for his pistol. That's when the posse opened up fire. Folliard took a round to the chest as the Kid and the others spun their mounts and lit out. Rudabaugh's horse had also taken around and faltered just a mile down the trail, forcing him to hitch a ride behind Billy Wilson. They wouldn't go far, though. Ended up taking refuge a few miles to the east in an old stone house near Stinking Springs. And it's there, Stinking Springs, where Pat Garrett found him just a few days later. Garrett and his men surround the house under the cover of darkness. Early the next morning, Charlie Bowdry emerged to feed the horses, and, mistaking him for the kid, Garrett gives the order and Bowdry is shot dead. This was followed by the posse killing all the outlaws' horses that were picketed outside. Garrett, thinking that he was in for a long siege, then had a wagon of supplies brought in and busied his deputies cooking breakfast. Wasn't long before the smell of frying bacon wafted on down to that stone house, and, well, I reckon them outlaws decided that a hot meal sounded a whole hell of a lot better than a belly full of lead. Rudabaugh was the first to surrender, or at least he was after Garrett promised not to hand him over to vigilantes in Las Vegas. Pat agreed, so Dave stepped out, followed by Wilson, Pickett, and finally, Billy the Kid. Now, the prisoners were ultimately taken back to Las Vegas, but just temporarily. Keep in mind that folks were still blaming Rudabaugh for the death of that jail guard, Valdez, some 8 months prior. So much so that Garrett had to hold off a lynch mob that night and again the next morning as the prisoners boarded the train for Santa Fe. Things got so tense that Pat even threatened to free both Rudabaugh and the kid and arm them. Tensions finally eased enough for the train to leave the station, and they reached Santa Fe later on that evening without incident. Now, Billy would eventually be transferred to Mesilla, where he was found guilty of murder in Sheriff Brady. From there, he'd be sent to Lincoln to await a hangman's noose. And, well, if you're curious to learn more, check out that series I did on Billy the Kid. Link down below. As for Dave, he readily admitted to robbing the stage out of Vegas, as well as the other one he held up near Fort Sumner. Confessions that earned him a life sentence. According to author James B. Mills in his excellent book, Billy the Kid, El Bandido Simpatico, quote, he, Dave Rudabaugh, was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Nebraska State Penitentiary for robbing male stagecoaches. Before proceedings adjourned, one of the lawyers successfully motioned that the court suspend Rudabaugh's sentence for him to face trial in Las Vegas for the murder of Antonio Lino Valdez. Despite exhibiting no emotional response, the ice-cold Rudabaugh was convinced that he would be lynched by the citizens of Las Vegas before even reaching a courtroom there. End quote. And yeah, Dave was definitely worried about Vegas. Hell, just a few days later, he even tried digging his way out of jail, but got snitched out by another inmate. Per the Santa Fe New Mexican, quote, Rudabaugh gives up his case as hopeless. He says that he made up his mind that he must go to the penitentiary for life and had resigned himself to that fate. But now, he said, I am gone. When I leave here for Las Vegas, I will tell you all goodbye for good. They will murder me just as sure as I go to Las Vegas. He remembers the demonstration at the Las Vegas Depot when he, the kid, and Billy Wilson were brought to Santa Fe, and looks upon his death at the hands of the mob there as inevitable. And yeah, even the papers out of Las Vegas thought that Dave was a goner. Per the Las Vegas Daily Optic, quote, Rudabaugh was brought up in irons and showed a restless, uneasy condition of mind when he was taken from the train cars. He retained a stolid, hangdog demeanor and showed no disposition to recognize any of his old acquaintances. He is poor in flesh and does not weigh by 20 pounds as much as he did a year ago, while prancing up and down the streets of Las Vegas. What a change a year has brought forth. Then the free man, now the chained culprit, doomed to the decree of justice or possible Judge Lynch's mandate. For we hear the grumblings of men who have revenge in their heart. End quote. Now, as it turns out, Dave didn't have nothing to worry about. Not only was he not assassinated, but his lawyers even got him a change of venue. As such, he was back in the safety of the Santa Fe jail just 2 weeks later. It's there where he was tried and ultimately found guilty for the murder of Lino Valdez, a crime that he most likely did not commit, at least not directly. If you'll recall, it was Dave's companion, John Allen, who pulled the trigger. According to Rudabaugh, he had no intention whatsoever of busting Webb out of jail, and Allen acted solely on his own accord. As to how true that is, your guess is as good as mine. Something tells me that Dave Rudabaugh might not have been all that opposed to stretching the truth to stop from getting his neck stretched. Now, if you'd like to read all about the trial, including the court transcripts and Rudabaugh's own statements from the stand, then I would strongly suggest picking up a copy of the book Dirty Dave Rudabaugh by David G. Thomas. And according to Mr. Thomas, the New Mexico territorial law required that to convict a defendant of first-degree murder, the jury must satisfy 2 requirements. They must be certain beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was guilty, and they must be as equally certain that the act was premeditated. Apparently, the judge failed to address these requirements to the jury, and just going by what I read from the court transcripts, there certainly was reasonable doubt as to the premeditation. Either way, like I said, Rudabaugh was found guilty and sentenced to hang. His lawyers immediately filed an appeal, and the Supreme Court was scheduled to hear the case in January of 1882. But I guess Dave didn't much like the idea of his fate being decided by a bunch of dudes wearing robes. As such, on the morning of September 19th, 1881, just a few hours before sunrise, Rudabaugh picked the lock on his cell with a piece of wire. And instead of just walking out a free man, or at very least pouncing on the sleeping guard, he instead, for reasons that don't make the sense God gave a mule, called out the jailer's name and woke him up. And despite Rudabaugh having a loaded revolver, the guard decided to put up a fight. Once again, according to the Las Vegas Daily Optic, quote, Rudabaugh, although a powerful man, was no match for the sinewy guard. And although he fired a shot which glanced off the stone floor and entered a post in the placida, he was overpowered and disarmed. Now, where exactly Dave got his hands on that pistol is unknown, but later on he would claim to have had it hidden in his cell for over a month prior to the failed escape. Guards also found a file, a large quantity of bent wire, and a chisel. No word on whether or not there was also a rock hammer and a poster of Rita Hayworth. 2.5 months later, on December 3rd, 1881, Dave went ahead and gave it another go. And this time he was successful. He and 5 other inmates, his old friend J.J. Webb included, tunneled their way under the walls to freedom. Now, speaking of Webb, sources do vary, but it looks like he made his way to Arkansas under the alias of Samuel King, and it's there where he died of smallpox just a few months later. As for Rudabaugh, legend has it that he rode hell for leather to Tombstone and joined up with Curly Bill Brocious and the Cowboys. And according to some, it was Dave who dropped the hammer on both Morgan and Virgil Earp. Or at least that's how the story goes. For what it's worth, though, historian David G. Thomas ain't buying it. And I'm pretty sure I'm not buying it either. According to Thomas, the only evidence that Dave was ever in Tombstone comes from a letter written by attorney Edward P. Colburn, quote, in which he claimed Wyatt Earp of OK Corral fame had seen Rudabaugh among the men who attempted to assassinate his brother, Virgil. The letter in question, published in the Ford County Globe, reads as follows. Wyatt says after the first shock that he could distinguish David Rudabaugh and Curly Bill, the latter's body showing well among the bushes. Now, according to Mr. Thomas, this brief mention of a secondhand report caused many of the early researchers to assert that Rudabaugh did indeed flee to Arizona after escaping from jail. But other than the doctor's letter, there's zero evidence of this ever occurring. And to Thomas's credit, most Earp historians do agree. Rather than making a layover in Tombstone, the consensus seems to be that Dave instead just sought refuge down in Mexico. He spoke with reporters there in Chihuahua as early as January of 1883, and by the spring of 1884, Rudabaugh was reported to have been seen in the town of Omaco. According to the Daily Commonwealth out of Topeka, Dave was, quote, following the butcher business and said that he was going to Parral. A month later, he was spotted in El Paso, once again speaking with a reporter, quote, Dave is still a young man, and his handsome face and well-knit form would attract attention and excite comment anywhere. His hair was long, curly, and black as a raven. He sported a mustache neatly trimmed and waxed, of the same color as his hair, and his semi-civilized dress was of the richest possible description. The next and final newspaper mention of Rudabaugh, at least while he was still alive, comes from the Wichita Daily Eagle on November 27, 1884. Apparently, a range detective named Dick Carrollton was down in Mexico searching for stolen horses when he bumped into Rudabaugh, who, according to Dick, was busy running a saloon in the town of Pardo. After that, not a whole lot is known other than Dave working as a ranch manager and possible enforcer for Mexican land baron Luis Terrazas. I have read a few accounts saying that Dave lost his job on the ranch after getting caught stealing, but whether or not that's true is unknown. Either way, it looks as if Rudabaugh did indeed find himself at the town of Parral, Mexico by mid-February of 1886, and by all accounts, he was in rare form. According to an eyewitness, Fred Mazzulla, quote, he, Rudabaugh, ordered a bottle of tequila. He elbowed a half score of customers from the bar, spat some on the floor, cursed out the bartender, shoved a couple of peons against the wall, and then bellowed out for a poker game. Mazzulla then recalled that Dave, quote, played poker for 4 or 5 minutes, screamed that he had been cheated, stood up and shot 2 of the players dead. This was followed by Dave walking out of the cantina and just drunkenly taunting the residents who were milling about in the plaza. At least he did until a local grocer by the name of Jose grabbed up a Winchester and put a bullet squarely in Rudabaugh's chest. This was followed by Jose strolling over and cutting Dave's head clean off with a bone and knife. The citizens of Parral then marched around with Rudabaugh's head on a pike as his body was unceremoniously dumped in a hole at the edge of town. As to the fate of his noggin, nobody seems to know whatever became of it, but I have heard anecdotal stories claiming that the locals used it as a privy. Now, Dave Rudabaugh might be dead, but me and you still got a few things to talk about. Namely, why in the hell did Rudabaugh decide to go on a killing spree down in Old Mexico? If you've been paying attention throughout the course of this episode, you may have noticed that despite Dave's deadly reputation, he wasn't exactly stacking bodies left and right. Sherry was involved with the killing of Lino Valdez over in Vegas, but most likely it was his buddy, John Allen, who pulled the trigger. Dave may have then killed Allen shortly thereafter, a mercy killing of sorts, but that's yet to be proven. Rudabaugh was present at White Oaks when Deputy Carlisle bit the dust, but once again, other than a tiny bit of secondhand information, there's no way of proving that he contributed to Carlisle's early demise. Likewise with his alleged participation in the shootings of Morgan and Virgil Earp. You got one brief mention of Rudabaugh in the letter, and that's it. As I mentioned earlier, most historians don't even think Dave was ever in Tombstone. In other words, there's just not a whole lot of evidence showing that Rudabaugh was some sort of meaner-in-hell, cold-blooded damn killer. Sure, he was a thief, but even then, the best he ever managed was to steal a few horses and rob a couple of stagecoaches. What I'm trying to say is that Rudabaugh's final chapter down there in Parral seems to be just a little out of character. There are some who think that Dave became a drunkard there at the end, and maybe that explains his turn for the worse. Or who knows, maybe he had done similar type stuff in the past and we just don't know about it. Or maybe that wasn't Dave Rudabaugh who lost his head in Mexico. Maybe it was somebody else and Dave just went with it. And yes, there are stories about Rudabaugh returning to the United States under an assumed name and eventually dying in Oregon in the late 1920s. For what it's worth, though, a paper out of Tombstone would publish Rudabaugh's obituary on March 23, 1886. Now, I was planning on reading the entire thing, but turns out there's a few words I can't pronounce, so you'll just have to check it out in the aforementioned book, Dirty Dave Rudabaugh, Billy the Kid's Most Feared Companion, by David G. Thomas. That said, the obituary did get a number of facts wrong concerning Dave's life. For instance, he never robbed any banks, and the only time he tried holding up a train, it turned out to be an abject failure. He also most likely never spent time in Arizona rustling cattle, and I'm not aware of him shooting up any frontier settlements. At least not till that grocer did him in down in Mexico. Fact is, Dave Rudabaugh was simply a mid-level bandit who just so happened to be in close proximity to more notable characters from the Old West. Guys like Doc Holliday, Billy the Kid, and Bat Masterson. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that if it wasn't for Young Guns 2, there's a good chance none of us would even know who the hell Rudabaugh was. No, he never taught Doc Holliday how to shoot a gun. And rumors notwithstanding, there is zero evidence that Billy the Kid was ever afraid of him. Now, before we call it a day, if you don't mind, I would like to go ahead and discuss Rudabaugh's various nicknames. Both Arkansas Dave and Dirty Dave do get tossed around quite a bit, but I'm sure you already know what I'm going to say. There is no evidence that he was ever known by either of those monikers. The whole Dirty Dave thing seems to have originated from a single newspaper article published by the Las Vegas Daily Optic in December of 1880, shortly after Dave's arrest at Stinking Springs. The article in question declared that Rudabaugh was wearing the same clothes as he had been wearing 9 months prior when he was last in Vegas, quote, apparently not having made any raids upon clothing stores, end quote. That's it. That is literally the extent of any mention of Rudabaugh being allergic to soap. It's also in direct contradiction of that other newspaper report of him looking dapper in El Paso. And as far as the Arkansas thing goes, well, that appears to have found its genesis in the mind of noted screenwriter and film producer John Fusco. However it came into being, it does seem to have happened after Rudabaugh's lifetime. There are zero known photos of Dave Rudabaugh other than the ones taken shortly after his death. Probably one of the most famous images you might see online is a menacing-looking character with a dark mustache and what appears to be a bow tie. But as it turns out, there is zero provenance connecting that photo with the real Dave Rudabaugh. Likewise with the other picture allegedly showing him and Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett hanging out smoking cigars. Zero provenance. There are a few others as well, but not a single one of them is verifiable. The closest we can get are the death photos, and unlike the pictures I just mentioned, the death photos do have provenance. The photographer was a 19-year-old by the name of Albert W. Lawn. Originally from Chicago, Lawn was earning a living traveling around Mexico taking portraits. He happened to be there in Parral when Rudabaugh was killed, and he did end up snapping 4 separate photographs, only 2 of which he printed and sold as postcards. According to Rudabaugh biographer David G. Thomas, quote, when the governor of the Mexican state of Durango, the state located south of Parral, learned that Lon was selling postcards of Rudabaugh's severed head, he demanded that the photos and negatives be turned over to him. Lon acceded to the governor's request and gave him the 2 negatives that he had printed. He retained the negatives of the 2 poorer photographs which he had not printed. End quote. These 2 remaining photos wouldn't see the light of day until 1943, when a collector of Western memorabilia got his hands on them directly from Mr. Lon. You can find them online if you're curious, but just keep in mind they are very graphic. One of them shows a mob carrying Rudabaugh's head on a pole, and the other, a much clearer image, depicts a close-up of Dave's face being cradled in the hands of what appears to be a Mexican federale. Interestingly enough, this was not the only famous beheading to take place in Parral. It was there, just 37 years after Rudabaugh's death, that Pancho Villa was shot and killed from ambush. Villa was buried there in Parral the following day, and then, just 3 years later, someone dug him up and made off with his skull. To this day, nobody knows what happened to Pancho's head. There are rumors that it's currently in the possession of Yale University's Skull and Bones Society, but who the hell knows?